Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, talking science of endurance and everything sports science in general. Welcome back to another live stream up on the channel Wednesday nights. We are answering all of your questions about sports science, endurance, and everything that you want to just have a bit of a conversation about, really, in terms of the industry in general. So, looking forward to getting some of the questions away again. As always, we'll have a bit of a chat about some things. First of all, I do have some questions that got submitted through from some various other channels through the comment sections in previous videos that I want to talk about, but then also across on Instagram as well. I've got some great questions coming through there at the moment that I wanted to share with you first, get the ball rolling, and then allow a few people to sort of build into live stream, join us, and ask their questions as well. As always, the highlights of this live stream will be put up throughout later in this week, probably tomorrow, where I'll break down some of the best questions and some of the best content from tonight. So looking forward to some of the questions that we get into, and looking forward to seeing as many people in here as we can. So when you do jump into the live tonight and you jump on, say hello in the chat. Let me know you're here. Even if you just leave a thumbs up, it'd be good to see who is joining us tonight. And as always, leave your questions there to be able to have a bit of that conversation and get your questions answered first and foremost about everything to do with endurance as well. As always, I'm gonna ask every single time. It'd be really, really good if you could hit that share button down below and share this with someone who you think might be interested in asking a question, or has had a question, or might just be interested in listening into some of the conversation we get into tonight. Hit the share button, share it with someone that you train with, someone that you know is also training in the endurance space, whether a coach, whether an athlete, interested to get their input in the conversation. As always, make sure you are subscribed to the channel to keep up to date for when we go live, and some of the other videos that have been coming out. You would have seen recently, did put up yesterday a video about a new pair of shoes. The cramping video last week did quite well. I got some great feedback talking about the ins and outs of cramping, the science behind cramping, etc. But then also, there's plenty of other videos coming in the next little while, particularly when we're talking about a few of my philosophies, particularly things like strength training for endurance athletes, go a bit more in depth. I know I've done some videos previously about some of the science, but more talking about my philosophies and a few of those things. Aaron, welcome back to the live stream. Great to see you every week, as always. Make sure you leave your questions in the chat to get the ball rolling. But what I will do is I'm going to jump into some of these questions we got. We had some great questions come through, and welcome to anyone who is watching on the replay. The full replay always will go up, but then the highlights video, keep an eye out for that, just so you can get across all the best questions that do come through. I'm going to go through a couple of these questions that did come through, a couple in the comments on a previous video from last week that unfortunately Ben, who sent them through, couldn't join us tonight, so he wanted to send them through in the comments. Left me a note on Instagram as well to let me know. It'd be great to sort of share these. He thought they'd be useful questions, and I definitely think they are. And he had a couple there, but I pulled out two of the ones that I think are really the most important for everyone who might be watching or watching the replay, and our community in general, in terms of in and around VO2 Max was where he was mainly sort of spending his time. So I'll kick it off with that. I can't bring him up on the screen, unfortunately, because I don't have him as a comment tonight or part of the chat, so it's a little bit more difficult. I do this a bit manually. But Ben's first question was around, does VO2 Max change across different sports? And it's a really interesting conversation I have with a lot of athletes, whether it's talking about a triathlete who's going between bike and run, for example, is the classic case of, does it change? Is it the same? The really simple answer is VO2 Max theoretically should be the same across all of your sports. From an absolute perspective, you should have a maximal oxygen consumption that you can get to. That generally will only occur, though, if you are completely equally trained in all of those sports. So this is where someone like a triathlete at the elite level, we quite often see that their difference in VO2 max is pretty small. It's very, very minimal, maybe 1 to 2 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute as a relative measure. As an absolute measure, very, very small differences as well. Maybe sort of 10 mils per minute, 20 mils per minute, very minute difference, mainly for the fact because they're equally trained. They're able to perform the same relative output in terms of intensity, so therefore it requires the same maximal oxygen consumption. Where it differs mainly for athletes who are across a number of different sports, or an athlete who is lesser trained in one, so typical amateur age group athlete who might be a really good cyclist and moving into triathlon, or the other way around, they're a great runner moving into triathlon, so their cycling is weaker. Whichever way, we typically see the weaker sport is obviously going to be lesser, mainly because they can't output that maximal intensity. And great examples from some of the athletes I've tested before in the lab, where we see they're a really good endurance runner, and they're getting into triathlon, for example. They jump on the bike, and their bike test, their VO2 max is significantly down. They might be 60 to 65 mils per kilo per minute on the run, and all of a sudden they're sort of 50 to 55 on the bike. And why is this the case? It's because One, it's just a specificity of training. You need to be able to train for what you're needing prepared to do. So they're just not used to being on the bike. Two, particularly in that circumstance where we go from run to bike, we typically see lower, mainly because we get a lot of localized muscular fatigue. So the legs have to do all of the work as I guess, outside of what you would see in a running economy side of things, where the running technique and the lift you create by using the arms and swinging the arms can actually help you and be of benefit as well. So all of these things are contributing factors as to why it might be lower. We also have to consider the differences as well. We're going to see pretty different heart rates, pretty different ventilations also. But when we are equally trained, we should see similar differences in terms of upper body sports versus lower body sports. Potentially someone's going to fatigue a lot quicker in something like rowing, swimming, maybe kayaking than they might if they're in cycling or they come from a cycling background. The lower body, obviously bigger muscle groups, so you can produce a lot more power for a long period of time before they fatigue compared to the upper body. But if you're high enough trained, you're probably going to outperform that lower body activity. If you're minimally trained in the legs, and you don't do much cycling, and you're doing a bunch of rowing, well, of course you're going to perform better in the rowing. So there is difference. It can be different across the sports, but it should, in theory, if we were equally trained in everything, which we know not every athlete is, in theory, we should all be the same. That's a very simple breakdown of it. I have done a video that is a bit more comprehensive of the breakdown, particularly between cycling and running, because they're the main two when we talk about triathletes getting involved. But it's really, across all sports, we should see some pretty sort of similar differences. I'm going to jump in. We've got a great question that's come through into the chat here, so I might bring it up on the screen. Going back to old school without heart rate strap or smartwatch training, how does one keep track of training endurance? Do we just go back to time and RPE focus? Interesting question. And this is something I think a lot of athletes have had the opportunity to do over the last little while. I know I've done it at stages, particularly through COVID and lockdowns and things like that, where you've got a number of restrictions on you. So going out and running at your regular pace or running at your regular heart rate may not be practical. A lot of athletes who are stuck in their 5K radius might have to run hills when they may not normally, or ride hills when they may not normally. So all of these things can sort of influence it. When we're talking about then what do we use to monitor our training intensity? How do you keep track? Time and RPE is a really, really good method. I mean, the breakdown in terms of monitoring things like training load, if you look at some of the research of comparing complex methods of analyzing training load, so acute to chronic work to rest ratio, even looking at things like TSS from a training peaks perspective, if you're using that software, any type of training stress score, acute stress, chronic stress, anything like that on your software, if you're using Strava, training peaks, whatever it may be, RPE multiplied by minutes or time, RPE multiplied by time, ends up giving a very, very comparable metric in terms of training volume. This was something we incorporated into actually one of my projects for my master's degree earlier this year. We're talking about an annual training program for an athlete, and we're actually talking about how we can manage training load. And a really simple and effective way is actually to use RPE and duration, because the match between your perception of intensity and what your physiological output is in terms of if you're using pace or heart rate is going to be pretty good if you're reasonably trained. If you're brand new into a sport, of course you're going to feel like you can run faster than what you can, particularly or ride harder than what you can, particularly early days, until you sort of work out where you are. But once you got that understanding of what your body can actually do, you have a pretty good idea of what a 10 out of 10 feels like. You have a good idea of what a 7 out of 10 feels like, all of these little ins and outs. So then multiplying it by time is actually a really good way of just monitoring training load and training stress across a training cycle. Things that you might use outside of that, I know a really effective one and I use it a lot on the bike when I'm trying to control some of my intensity, do some zone 2 endurance type stuff, is I just breathe in and out through my nose. That restricts the intensity as well. That's not using any metrics, that's not using any numbers, but I actually find it keeps me within that zone 2 because it's limiting a little bit in terms of what my oxygen supply is. And when I feel like I need to breathe like in through my nose and out through my mouth, I go, okay, I'm probably pushing a little bit hard, but I'm kind of on the edge. When I start breathing in and out through my mouth, I know I'm pushing way too hard for that type of session. So that's also a bit of a guide that I use. It is reasonably good. I've done a little bit of testing in terms of how does that stack up compared to your training zones based on a lab test, etc. But it's the type of thing that it's reasonably close to where your training zones would actually fit, because when we get changes in things like lactic acid, we have to go up into the next block of intensity. And as intensity increases, we get changes in lactic accumulation in the system. We need increases in ventilation to combat that and get more oxygen in to sort of combat that increase in lactic acid. So if we're getting If we're changing how we're breathing, that's a pretty clear sign of that. If we need to breathe through the mouth more, obviously we're going to be trying to get more ventilation, more air in, etc., and dump a bit more CO2 and try and work through that process. So any of those methods, RPE is a really good one. Using time as well is a good one as also, because then you can start to think about, well, if I need to do some interval training, time instead of distance can be a better metric. I need to run at a 9.5 out of 10 for 2 minutes, and then I'm going to have a walking recovery. That you can make it quite pretty close to what you would be doing if you're looking at stuff. So by all means, if you're going back that old school approach, there's some strategies you can use, and it definitely can work. It's really a bit of a motivation thing too. I personally like using a little bit of that data and sort of getting into as much specificity when it comes to exactly what intensity I'm working at. But if you're wanting to go back a little bit old school for a period, because it's going to help shake up your training, give you a bit of variety, freshen things up, and then get back into a bit more of what you might call a new school method, it could be a really good way to go. So definitely a worthwhile process to be thinking, and you're definitely on the right track there with that sort of thought process. All right, moving back onto one of the questions that came through prior to tonight, while we wait for anyone else to jump in and ask their question, because a great one. Thanks for sending that one through. Really great question about changing up how you're looking at your training intensity. Second question that did come through from Ben from before, like I said, we had some questions come through prior to the stream, guys who couldn't make it tonight. And if you can't make it tonight, or you can't make it to one of our live streams, head over to my Instagram page. We're getting very, very close, and as a bit of a challenge to everyone who is watching this either now or on the replay, head over to my Instagram at NJ_sportscience. I'll leave it up at the end of the live as well, as always, to check out that end screen. You'll see my tag there. But heading over there, ask your question there is the easiest way to get directly in contact. I'll provide a written response immediately once you send it through, but then also I'll be able to cover it on the live stream so others can benefit as well. That's a really good way to get directly in contact with me. But also, we're getting close to 1,000 followers. It'd be really good if we can start continuing to build the community that we've got going on here on YouTube, over there on Instagram as well. So go check that one out and keep the questions coming in. Coming back to your question about the old school and new school, motivation is hard for old school. It definitely is, because it is so reliant on you pushing yourself if you have to push hard in a session, or you restricting that intensity. Whereas when you've got a watch or some heart rate data to look at, it's that objective sort of, I guess, accountability of you're pushing too hard or you're not pushing hard enough. You can kind of keep yourself really accountable. Whereas, yeah, when you're looking at RPE, it's kind of a case of going out and going, or that's a little bit of doubt starts to creep in your mind, doesn't it? About am I working at the right RPE to start with, and is that equating to the right physiological response as well? So it is kind of one of those tricky things to manage and deal with. But like I said, there's definitely some ways around that you can start to use some little sort of techniques to make the most of it as best you can. All right, so coming back, like I said, to Ben's question that came through on the comment section of a previous video, following on from talking about VO2 max in different sports, and another topic we have touched on, but it's always worthwhile revisiting, particularly because Ben started asking some great questions about some, when I say non-traditional testing sports, things like kayaking or things like swimming. How do we monitor and test for VO2 max? I'll go through some of the basics in terms of running. Running's a really easy one to test for VO2 max out in the field. I'm not talking in the lab, hooking up to the mask, things like that. I'm talking out in the field where you don't have access to that equipment and you need to kind of, I guess, work out what is my VO2 max intensity. And the really easy way to do that is to go and do basically a 6-ish minute effort is pretty much going to tell you. Doing a 6-minute run for distance is a really, really good way of getting a really easy VO2 max. And it's a little bit nicer for most people than running a 2K time trial. Although 2K time trial's got really good comparison to a VO2 max intensity. Again, this isn't going to give you everything you might get in a ramp test. You would normally get sort of all the stages and what your oxygen consumption is doing throughout. This is more going to give you that exact VO2 max intensity only. And from there, you can start to map out everything sub-maximally. But doing a 6-minute run for a maximal distance and then working out, all right, what pace was I running over that time, or the average pace over that time, is a really easy one. 2K time trial, like I said, is a really sort of classic way of testing VO2 max. Moving into something like cycling, jump on Zwift and do the 1-minute ramp test is basically what I've been giving athletes in lockdown as well. Basically, every 1 minute, increase by 20 watts until you can't go anymore. Keep pushing yourself as hard as possible until you get to the maximum level. That maximum output at the last stage you finish is probably going to be that VO2 max wattage, or pretty close to anyway. It's going to give you a reasonable idea. You could also use a different type of ramp test. Maybe a 3-minute ramp test is what we would use in the lab to get a bit more of a steady state. it's really all about just seeing what intensity can you get to, and then being able to map out things from under there. So yeah, like I said, ramp test on Zwift is probably a good starting point if you're looking for just a really simple practical test, and probably doing it on a smart trainer just helps control some intensity. For some of these non-traditional ones, I really like that theory of, all right, what can we do for max distance for about a 6-minute period? I think is a really simple way of doing it. Whether you're in the pool and swimming for a 6-minute period and going for as many laps as you can or as much distance as you can. If you're an open water swimmer, a little bit easier because you don't have to turn. Obviously, you have to deal with current and things like that, so that might complicate it a little bit. Kayaking, surf ski, paddleboard, any of those type of paddle type sports, simple way of doing it is that 6 minute for distance. Go as far as you can, calculate what speed you were averaging over that 6-minute time, and that's probably going to be pretty close to your VO2 max intensity. And then again, you can map out your subtleties from there. There's a number of different ways that you can do field tests for these different sports, but it all really comes down to VO2 max fundamentally is going to be about a 5 to 7 minute, broadly, if we're looking at a spectrum, 5 to 7 minute solid maximal effort. If you can sustain that pace for 5 to 7 minutes, it's probably your VO2 max intensity across any sport, really. That's going to give us as much or as close of an idea as possible. So that's a really simple way of looking at field tests. So hopefully that sort of clears up for a few others who might be thinking the same thing. Obviously, labs and things like that are closed at the moment because of COVID, particularly here in Melbourne. We're really wanting to get back to the lab to do some testing, but some field testing might be a good alternative for now until we can get to that stage. We're hoping not too far, but all throughout COVID, I've been using field tests with athletes I've been consulting with and doing some programming for and working with and helping them through. And we've been getting some pretty good success with them. Yes, it's not as accurate and as good as what we would have in a lab, but it's getting us majority of the way there. And I think that's the key. If it's going to give you the best bang for buck in terms of the amount of information it's going to give, it's going to be simple and practical and actually usable in all circumstances. That's the way to be going. So hopefully that gives some ideas around some field testing. We've got some other great questions coming in. Sam, welcome back to the live stream. Good to have you back on again. I'll bring a question up on the screen here. So we've got glycogen stores typically last about 2 hours of activity. So how much do glycogen stores deplete before the exercise while athletes wait so they don't get a stitch? Follow up to this question here as well. Some people need to wait 30 minutes while others it is 2 hours. I think what you're referring to here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is maybe I guess the simple way we could look at this is before a training session or before a race is probably the big one as well. How long do you need to wait before you get into it? And I think it is a little bit individual. So you're right. Some athletes might only need 30 minutes. I know I can have something to eat within that sort of hour period, not a massive amount. It might be a banana, or it might be a energy bar, like a muesli bar or something that is just going to be short, sharp, give me a good burst of fuel to just keep me going. But also I've probably had my big meal a couple of hours before that. And that's what I'd probably recommend. If you're going to get into a big race for the day, a big training session, if you're playing a game of sport, whatever it may be, 2 or so hours before, get that big meal in so you've got as much fuel in your system as you can, and then just top up within that 2 hours. So when I say top up, it might be a banana, might be a bit of sports drink, it might be a bar of some sort, it might be like anything that's small and going to give you some carbs that's going to keep you ticking along. You don't want too many really hot, what we call high GI carbs, so the really fast burning ones. And that's why we typically recommend athletes stay away from things like gels immediately, or even sports drinks to an extent, but predominantly gels immediately before you get into the race, because what it's going to do is it's going to inhibit, or it's going to accelerate the process of which you're burning through carbs, which for long endurance type stuff, it's just going to deplete your fuel stores almost before you started. It's going to sort of burn through all the fuel you were sort of waiting to use as soon as you get into the race. And that's where athletes can start to hit the wall earlier than anticipated. So I guess if I'm answering the question sort of right there, how much time do you need? It's really a case of, well, it probably almost starts the few days before. Have you fueled up adequately the few days before? Did you have a good quality meal? Probably about 2.5 hours before the event, before the big training session. Ideally, some circumstances, you're waking up, you're doing a fasted training session or a pretty low intensity long ride on a Saturday morning. You're not going to wake up at 4 a.m. to then go out riding at 6 a.m. It's not practical. I'm talking maybe sort of race days, probably when you're going to do that, because you're going to go and you're going to be able to set up your stuff. And particularly like Ironman, for example, if you're getting there for a 6 a.m. race start, you're there at 4:30, or you're waking up at 4 to then get ready to go down there for about 5 o'clock or so to finish your transition setup, and then you can get into your race. So having breakfast almost immediately when you wake up is probably going to be a good alternative. And then again, just top yourself up. you really do want to be avoiding big amounts of fuel and big amounts of low GI carbs, because what in the, I guess, the immediate period, like that 30-minute period, and why you're getting a stitch is mainly because of the blood flow difference. When we've got fuel that we need to be digesting, or stuff in the stomach that's needing digestion, we send all of our blood flow there because that's the priority, isn't it? It's trying to absorb those nutrients to get the fuel into the system. When we start to perform, though, we need blood flow to go to the extremity. So now we're in this dilemma where it's like, well, where do we actually want blood flow to go? Do we need it at the stomach digestive system, or do we need it at the working muscle? The body's going to want to prioritize working muscle, but because we're getting a bit at the stomach as well, and it's coming away from the stomach, we don't have as much blood flow there to actually able to process and digest it as well as we possibly can. We now run into some issues in terms of that stitch sort of feeling. It can also happen when we've got way too much fluid sitting in our system as well. That's another one that athletes get a lot, is drinking too much. Body just can't absorb it well enough because the blood flow is not there to be able to help with that absorption of the fluid or of the nutrients, because the blood flow is going elsewhere. So we can start to worry about that. But yeah, I wouldn't be having big amounts of food within that sort of like definitely that half an hour window, but probably within that hour to hour and a half, I wouldn't be having big amounts of food. 2 hours, if you're doing something in the afternoon, like have lunch at sort of 12, and if your event is like 2 p.m. onwards, that's the ideal. We're sort of talking about big sort of fueling up meal a couple of hours before, and then just use your top ups to get you into the event. That's going to avoid majority of the issues. If you still have a stitch after that, maybe then you have to consider, well, what foods and what inputs were actually going through. Was it the type of food I ate? Was it the type of carbs I ate at my lunch? Was it the type of snacks that I then had? If you're having something like a breakfast and then you're topping up, maybe cereal and milk doesn't really sit well with you, so that's what's actually causing you to have that sort of upset or gastrointestinal upset. That's really, really common. If you're an athlete like me, I can wake up in the morning and have a bowl of Weet-Bix with milk and a whole bunch of stuff, banana, the works, and I can get into the race and I'll be perfectly fine as long as I've had it a reasonable period before. So really, there's a bit of an individual play there, but hopefully that answers your question, Sam, about when we should be fueling and how we should be fueling in that immediate part. And again, it mainly bases on race theory, what we're talking here, but it also can transfer over into some of those big training sessions throughout the week as well. Just before I get into Naruto's next question, because he's on fire, or he or she, sorry if I got that wrong there. You're on fire sending these questions through, and I get to it in a moment. Just while we've got a few more people in, did have some questions come through prior to the live stream. If you did miss those, they'll be available on the replay. So I talked through them first. I do still have one I want to get to in a moment that came through on Instagram. And if you haven't checked out Instagram yet, go over and follow, because that's the best place to get directly in contact with me. Send me a direct question. If you can't make a live stream, ask your question and I can bring it up anyway. Or if you just want to talk through something a bit more personal in terms of your situation, performance, whatever it may be. Best way to find me is on Instagram at NJ_sportscience. Easiest way to, like I said, get directly in touch. Go check that one out. And we're definitely on the road to 1,000 followers at the moment. We're not too far off, about 100 or so left to go. So it'd be great if as many people can head over there, hit the follow button, and help continue to support the community as best we can. Getting into Naruto's next question. Garmin Coach has hill repeat sets. I did 30 seconds uphill, 30 seconds rest walk, 30 seconds downhill. Do you need to train downhill? Great question. Other than just being more aware of environment and footing when running downhill. I think there's a follow-up here. I was thinking downhill is better to train speed endurance, where it's assisted acceleration downhill and maintaining during the flat ground. Really interesting discussion in terms of the uphill downhill scenario. It's probably something that we don't talk about massive amounts. I've just worked out it's Jonathan. Sorry, mate. I'm just using your tag on there. I know you're one of the top fans here on the channel. I apologize for just using your username there, but all good. I'll remember that for next time. In terms of running downhill, I guess scenario, there's some interesting adaptations we can get from the downhill side of things, and I actually really, really like it. So what we're gonna see when we run uphill, I always think about it as just an increase in resistance. So it's almost like when you're pedaling on the bike and you're changing through the gears. It's going to make it a little bit more difficult to maintain that same speed, inevitably. So we're going to get a bit more of an effect there. Obviously, it's going to be fatiguing to some extent. Flat, you're going to get the best bang for buck in terms of your economy, so we can get those really high-quality speed efforts out of the way, and that's going to be the most applicable for majority of events and races. When we start getting into races that have hilly terrain, etc., it's going to be a little bit different, of course, but if you're racing on the flat, obviously trying to build some speed on the flat and be able to propel yourself is going to be the most specific. But then also it's the most, I guess, natural in terms of when you're on the flat, you have to produce 100% of the effort, and there's no other external factors that are contributing to no other external factors that are contributing to you being fast or slow. It is what it is, if that makes sense. When we're going downhill, we have a lot more eccentric loading because we're absorbing a lot more force. When we go uphill, stride shortens up a bit because you're inevitably going uphill like this. So I don't have as much distance to travel in terms of my leg coming through from the back of the stride to the front. So you're probably going to increase your cadence a little bit when you're going uphill sort of naturally. When you're on the flat, you can dictate it as best you like. When you're going downhill, even if you do try to shorten up your stride length or you try to really back off the intensity, because you are going downhill, you have more of an effect of gravity. There's more force coming into the ground every time you take the step. You're going to get a lot more what we call eccentric loading. So absorption of forces. You're going to get more of that. That is really, really fatiguing. So anyone who knows or anyone that's done a fair bit of running downhill, you would know that you end up pulling out quite sore if you do too much of it. If you are going for a specific effect, though, it can be quite useful because it builds really good resilience to those decelerations in your stride. And when I mean decelerations, I mean absorbing. Foot comes into contact with the ground, it slows you down to then accelerate you out of the stride again. And that slowing down part, that absorbing force, is that eccentric component I'm talking about. You might also get this type of stimulus in like the down phase of a squat. That's the eccentric part where we're absorbing the load, or when you're doing plyometric jumps and you're landing. That landing component is what we're talking about here. But it's exaggerated when we run downhill. So the faster you run downhill and you almost do some overspeed work, you end up running way quicker than what you could on the flat. We just lift up what the body can then start to tolerate, and we're increasing its tolerance to those high loads and those high forces. Like I said, I wouldn't be doing massive amounts of it, but it can be good to build some resilience through things like the Achilles, through the hamstring in particular, probably even through the calf as well. All of these areas where we commonly see some of those injuries, running on a downhill and doing some overspeed work, just little bits and pieces of it, can be quite useful. I think what you've got here in terms of your ideas around, or the sessions around doing 30 seconds uphill, 30 seconds rest, 30 seconds downhill, those short bursts are good. Keep in mind what the terrain is as well. Obviously, you want to be safe doing this. I typically would recommend doing the really high speed downhill stuff when you're on a stable surface, like a tarmac-y type surface or a road type surface. If you're doing trail type stuff, just be mindful of your footing and the increased likelihood of you rolling an ankle or doing something a bit damaging is probably going to start to creep in. But there is some quite good benefit. It's also used in I guess team sport athletes and sprinters as well, to be able to create that overspeed stimulus. Get the body having to work at a much quicker pace than what it can produce on its own, because you've got that assistance of going downhill. So that's where I really like it. But again, it's not something I would be spending 100% of my week on. It'd be the type of thing, maybe one session in the week I'd throw a little bit of it in, and it might only be some short bursts like 30 seconds, or it might just be like a 10-15 second burst to start with to get you used to it, and can be a good sort of just addition to the program, just to ice it off. It's another one of those 1%ers just to give you a bit better tolerance to loads through the hamstring, through the Achilles, and the lower limb in particular. You obviously want to be careful about how forceful your impact to the ground, because it can put some more stress through the body, as I said, so fatigue's a factor. But outside of all that, you're probably doing reasonably okay by adding that in. I think you're going to be getting a really good stimulus, a really good benefit from it as well. So for that answers your question there. Sam, coming back to yours in terms of the fueling side of things before. So as long as you top up, your glycogen stores won't be depleted to the point where you run out. I have a big meal 9 ounces for, and that works for me. Yeah, like I said, in terms of topping up, it's just making sure that you have enough fuel for what you need, because inevitably, as soon as you put fuel into the body's going to want to start to burn it, because it's there and available, particularly things like glycogen and carbohydrate. The body wants to use it, and you're going to need it to be able to power just basic processes, basic breathing, life, your brain function, all needs fuel. So by topping up, you're just limiting how much you're cutting into. But like I said, having that big meal 2 hours before, where you've got some really good low GI carbohydrates, so slow burn carbohydrates, then just use some top ups of some similarly slow, but not quite as slow. So when I say that, you might have your cereals and that type of stuff, or like maybe porridge type stuff, those long burning carbohydrates, if you want to call them out, to simplify it. Then you get into things like your bananas and those little snacks that are still going to be reasonably long burning, but not quite as long as a cereal, but they're not super short like a gel. And then when you get into the race, it's all about quick absorption. We just want things happening really, really quick. You made another comment here. I'm worried about wasting 20% of my glycogen stores in the 90-minute period waiting before you exercise. And yeah, that's all to do with top up. Also to do with what you did the days before. And that's why things like not necessarily carbohydrate loading excessively, but having some good quality carbs in the days before to top you up a little bit. obviously overnight, the night before you get into that event or before you get into that game, the race, whatever it may be, you're going to be burning fuel just as a recovery and repair process anyway. Have that good quality meal 90 to 2 hours before, and that's going to replenish most of what you burnt overnight. Then your top-ups are going to be key. You're not going to, unless you've got an excessive amount of nervous energy and you're sitting there and you're literally like shaking, or you're going and doing crazy amounts of warm-up beforehand, you're not going to be burning through massive amounts of your glycogen stores. If you're keeping pretty calm, pretty relaxed, go and do your warm-up as you need to. Have those top-ups. You're going to be pretty fine. And then as long as you're keeping on top of it, depending on the type of event throughout the event or throughout the training session, fueling reasonably regularly throughout and making sure you're getting enough fuel back in for what you're losing, you're going to be well and truly on the right track to avoid hitting the wall as best you can. And that's obviously what we all want to avoid at some point. Is we don't want to hit the wall, because when we hit the wall, things go wrong pretty badly, and it's not a fun place to be. Personally, speaking from experience in that side of things, but I'm sure others who are listening in have probably felt similar things. So yeah, great question as always, and great question for everyone who's asked one tonight in the chat. Really appreciate you jumping on, getting involved in the discussion. I've got another one here that I'm going to get to in a second, but as always, continue to subscribe to the channel. Hit the share button down below. We've got a little bit of time still left tonight to go through some questions. So if you do know someone who might be thinking of asking a question or has asked you a question, this is a perfect place to bring them in. So hit that share button, share it with someone right now if you know that they would definitely be interested in joining our conversation we got going on here. Got some great stuff from tonight, and as always, the highlights video and the full live stream replay will be available on the channel, so we can go through some of those the best questions from tonight, which we've had some great ones already, and break it down, cut it together, so it's a little bit easier for you guys to watch later. Then also the full live stream, if you're interested in watching it, will always be up straight away, so you can go back and skip through to the parts that you enjoyed or you want to listen to again. I'll make sure I keep putting those up for you, because obviously that's really important to particularly some of the guys who haven't been able to jump in. And that's where some of these questions, like the ones from Ben before, and then this last one here from Alan, that Alan, you might have seen in the chat in previous live streams, been quite active on the channel in the comments as well. He actually jumped over onto Instagram, and I'm not sort of making this up. He sent me a message. He jumped on Instagram, had a quick look at his profile because I recognize his name. He has 0 followers. He has 0 posts. He's not following anyone else. Jumped on, sent me a message and said, I signed up to Instagram today. I'm going to follow your page. I'm new to Instagram, haven't used it before, but I've heard on one of your videos it's the best way to get in contact with you. Here's my question. Can't join the live stream. Would love you to talk through it and sort of send a reply as well. We actually had a great conversation over there, so I really appreciate him jumping across. And if you're someone like him, jump across the Instagram page if you want to get that question directly through. And if you can't make the live stream, send it through there, because it's a good way to still get it answered and get in contact with me as well. So Alan's question, before I get back to yours, Jonathan, your next one. Alan's question talks about how to program in the longest run of the week. And this is something that a lot of us can sort of, I guess, have a bit of a conversation about, because it can often be that critical run of the week. If we're talking about a marathon runner, triathlete, how do we fit in that long run? Just in general, I might keep it simple and just focus on running, because I follow similar principles for triathlon. And then in his example, Alan's leading up to a marathon. So how do we go about programming it? How do we go about increasing the amount of Ks or the amount of time we're spending in that big long run in the week? How do we also adapt it as well throughout the training program? So the key principles I like to follow, if we start off with what happens in a base phase, we're just trying to build the Ks into legs, fundamentally. I always like working off time on legs rather than kilometers run, because when we focus on distance can mean a whole range of different things. You go out for a 20K run, that could be a really, really tough stimulus on the body because we're out there for a long period of time. It could also be a very, very easy stimulus on the body, or relatively easy stimulus, because we're out there just cruising along. It can be really hard because we're running a lot faster. There's so much variation depending on how you actually run that. I much prefer time on legs and then sticking to time in zone, if you like, particularly zone 2 in the base phase, where we're talking about just building the aerobic conditioning or the aerobic capacity. Time on legs is going to be much more beneficial, because at the end of the day, we need to train the body, and I speak about this a lot. The body doesn't have a GPS, has no idea, and coming back to some of the stuff we talked about with glycogen and fueling, the body has no idea how far you've gone. It just knows how long it's been working for, because it's got a fuel supply. It's like your car. If you took the odometer out of your car that measures the distance it's gone, you'd have no idea how far you've accumulated total in your car. All you know is that at some point I need to refill it to get more fuel in to be able to then go again. And if I don't refill it, then it's going to stop. That's basically really simply how the human body works as well. So when we talk about these long runs, I use time in zone, build it up slowly, aiming for by towards the middle to end of the program. We definitely want to be getting up to about, ideally in most circumstances, 100 to 110% of estimated race time or estimated split time. This isn't always the case. If you're looking at a 4-hour event, maybe you want to build up to 2.5 hours in your long run, your key long run, and then you do a supplementary run of like an hour and a half to sort of merge those together and get you the volume for the week. Can be another way of doing it. But if you're looking at something like a 3-hour marathon, or you're looking at a half marathon, building up to 110% of your estimated event time is a really good starting point to give you enough time on legs. It's going to teach you to be able to run for the period of time and a little bit longer than what you actually have to do in the event. That's the first thing. Can I get from start to finish? Because if I can get from start to finish, then I can worry about how quickly I do that and what the performance outcome of it is as well. Moving into, so basically I just sort of overload that as anyone would probably overload a program. Maybe increase by 5 to 10 minutes a week. That's going to increase by a couple of kilometers a week. Have a deload every couple of weeks and then reset and go again and continue to build. When I get into more that race specific phase or that build phase, whatever you like to call it, that's sort of 8 to 10 weeks out from race day, I might start to incorporate a little bit of a difference into that long run, maybe alternating week to week of 1 week is a zone 2, go out and do 2.5 hours of that long, consistent pace, build the aerobic capacity, time in zone, time on legs. The next week, I might distribute that a little bit more cleverly throughout the middle of the week. And that big focus or that big key run, maybe on the weekend for most athletes because it's most practical, is going to be some more maybe sub-threshold efforts, some tempo type running. Might do, instead of 2.5 hours like you did the week before, might only do an hour 45, but a lot of that's made up of more, I guess, quality intensity. So we're maybe doing a 20-minute piece in sort of tempo and then a 10-minute recovery run and repeating that 3 or 4 times throughout the session. We might do half an hour pieces. Like these longer sustained efforts closer to race intensity is how I sneakily bring in things like tempo into the program without kind of making it a separate session and thinking it's an addition. I'm just changing and substituting it. Then coming back the next week, so I've gone 2.5 hours zone 2. I've actually come down in total amount of volume covered or amount of time covered, but the intensity's gone up, so my loading's quite comparable, and it gets that race specificity in the legs and how long you can run at slightly higher intensity, which is going to be more specific as well. Get into that third week, and I go back to the zone 2 stuff and bring that back in, and I go up to maybe 2 hours 45, so start to stretch the volume a bit, and then I have my deload. In that middle week, something I do want to add here, in that middle week where we are doing something different with that long run, it's not just zone 2, because we're talking about race specific now, I do change up the middle of the normal stuff in the week, so I don't do as much, I guess, fatiguing work in terms of long interval, like not too much in terms of like threshold-based interval. Try to reduce the volume there because I'm getting more higher intensity volume on the weekend. Just a little side note on that, so you're not going and overcooking yourself, but it is the side of things that fitting in that long run is really critical. So building it just time on legs in the base phase is critical. You could also carry that across to the race specific. I've done that with athletes before, and it's been quite effective. I think it is really a case-by-case scenario of what are the athletes' needs. And I typically would get that from things like testing, having a look at previous race results. All right, what are some of the issues? You really blew up at the hour and a half mark, and your half marathon was an hour 45. Let's practice running for an hour 45 at a long slow, so at least we know we can get to the end, and we can run for that period of time total. Now let's work on how we can do that faster, and that's what that race-specific phase does. Working off that alternating structure works really well as well. I find that works really good for guys who are a little bit quicker, a little bit better trained. Either way, you just got to consider, well, what are we trying to achieve and what are the adaptations we're trying to go for? And that's going to sort of dictate you there. So really great question that Alan sent through on Instagram about how to program that longest run in. I typically will shift it to the weekend, as I said before, because it's most practical for athletes. But if you need it on a different day, you need to have it on a Friday instead of a Saturday, that doesn't really matter. That's just structuring the week individual difference. It's more how, I guess the key takeaway here is making sure you're consistently building a bit of that volume, having some deload in there every few weeks. It's all about time on legs. Can you run for the period of time you need to? And then you can, once you've started to build that up quite solidly and you're able to pretty much do that, then, all right, how do we translate that into being able to run that time, but doing it at a faster pace? And that's where that race specific comes in and where I start to change things, get a bit more creative. So hopefully that sort of gets people understanding how I go about that long run. Be interested to hear your thoughts. So leave them in the chat or leave them in the comment section if you are watching the replay about how you go about long, slow runs. Do you do it similar to what I might think or do? Happy to hear some thoughts as well. So let me know what you're thinking on those. Got another one here, Jonathan. Great to have you jumping in. Another question. Always good to see them coming through. And we've got a handful of us in here, so look, great to see a lot of you sticking around during the stream and listening to some other questions, getting an idea. Mind over body, how far should this be taken into consideration? One, completing 5K after a semi-rolled ankle, running halfway. So I'm assuming you rolled your ankle partway through the run. Let me know if I'm correct there. And two, speed sessions while having lactic acid cramps. Threshold training. I'm going to have a crack at these, but let me know if I'm slightly going off on the wrong track, because I might be misinterpreting you a little bit here. In terms of that first part, having a semi-rolled ankle, how much is it? Should we stop and actually consider the injury, and how much should we keep pushing ourselves? I would be saying we should be initially cautious, and you're always going to be. You're going to feel the pain initially of rolling your ankle, and it's never fun. Everyone's probably done it a handful of times, and some worse than others. Obviously, if it's at a point where you've clearly done some structural damage, rolling the ankle can vary from a slight inward turn and it's like, oh, that was a bit painful, all the way up to you've done ligament damage and you're probably not actually going to be able to walk on that foot. That's where I think it's really clear to make the distinction of, should you push through and it's mind over body. Should I just keep going, or should I back it off, or even potentially stop? When it's kind of in the middle, where you kind of tweak it and you're like, oh, that was a bit painful, just bring yourself back. If you have to drop the pace a bit or walk for a little bit, just to get the ankle moving and the foot moving again. If it starts to come good, keep going, because you shouldn't have really done too much damage. You also might be working off a bit of adrenaline too, so that's going to kick in and kind of, I guess, numb the significance of the pain as well. But really start to think about if it does, you're probably going to know if it's gone pretty well, in terms of if you rolled it pretty well, and I mean that in the worst way, like you've done some serious damage. You're going to know straight away whether to pull the pin or not. And I always err on the side of you're better off thinking about the long-term side effect of, if I push through here, is this going to do me long-term damage? And what is that going to do for further events, further training, further races? You might have some different motivations, but from my perspective, training and working with athletes, I always want them to be out there training and performing when they can, as best they can. And injuries are always detracting from that mindset, or detracting from that process. So if we then have to spend extra time on the sidelines trying to rehab an injury, that's never the ideal part, and it's going to put us backwards a significant way. So I'd probably say, if it is pretty significant, then absolutely stop. There's no point making it worse. You hear stories all the time of athletes, they're in their last race before they retire, or things like that, and they just push through. Do I recommend it? Not necessarily, because then there's also health side effects as well. Like if you rolled your ankle bad enough and you do some significant ligament damage, then that could mean physical activity in general becomes really, really difficult for you if it never really heals back to where it is long term, let alone racing and competing. It's then long term after that we can be still, I guess, feeling the impacts of it. So I look at it from that perspective. That's similar to how we look at things from a doping perspective as well. When we talk about performance enhancing substances and things like that, the keys to that are the keys to doping, really, in terms of anti-doping policy, is it performance enhancing, but then also, is it damaging to the athlete's health? And something like a rolled ankle, if it's just a minor sort of sprain and things like that, and you kind of run it out or walk it out and you're good to go, it's probably not going to be damaging long term. But if it's the type of thing that you can't even weight bear on it, then there's no point trying to just grit it out and push through, because you're going to do more damage long term to your own health and well-being. And that's the last thing that I would sort of recommend going into. And I'm sure a lot of medical professionals and physios and things like that would also not recommend pushing on past the point of where it's necessary. And going into races injured as well is always something that I advocate against. There's like, what's the point if you're going in injured, you're going in with a negative mindset already? If you're not going to be able to race as best you can, is it better just to pull the pin and move forward and rehab the injury and get back and be as strong as what you possibly can? I would argue yes. That's my opinion anyway. I'm sure others have the different, and at various stages we all probably push through something that maybe we should or shouldn't have. But I think it's always, you got to take that approach of what are the ramifications or consequences of this may be ongoing, and is it going to be damaging, yes or no? If you think it is, and you can't sort of outweigh the negatives with the positives, then probably a good point to stop. Coming to your second point there, in terms of speed sessions while having lactic acid cramps, you might need to be a little bit clearer in terms of what you're defining with cramp here. I know I did the video last week talking a bit more extensively about cramps. If you're more just talking that really significant burn in the legs, if you're depends on what you're doing again, and what you're trying to achieve. Because if you're going in and doing like if you're doing a threshold session, let's start with that, where you're trying to improve your functional threshold or your anaerobic threshold, you might be working at 100 or 105% of your threshold and then having a short recovery, like 5 minutes on, 2.5 minutes off. That type of session is really good. 1K repeats with like a 90-second recovery, very classic session. That type of thing, you're going to expect to be accumulating a large amount of lactic acid because we're having a short recovery and we're going again, we're pushing ourselves reasonably hard, and it's going to accumulate across the session. So as long as you're like, to an extent, you want to be improving that tolerance because the body's going to be stressed to, one, produce a bit more aerobic energy and force it to adapt and produce more aerobic, because it goes, I don't like this lactic acid, so I want to be more aerobic and less anaerobic. It's going to teach you better to tolerate and buffer that lactic acid, which is also going to help from a performance benefit and be able to push yourself harder for longer. But if it's getting to the point where it's causing you significant cramping and that's inhibiting your ability to actually produce the movement, produce the activity in the first place, whether you're running, whether you're cycling, whatever it may be, again, think about, well, am I going to do damage by trying to push through a cramp? Potentially. Apart from the fact that you're just not going to be able to produce the same output. It might be a case of just stop for a bit, do some static stretching. We know is a good method of relieving cramps after they already occur, not preventing necessarily, but relieving cramps when they onset, particularly things like the calf. It's really easy to sort of get a cramp out by just doing some basic static stretching. Maybe it's a case you do a bit of that and you actually feel okay. Again, it's probably easier from a cramping perspective, because once you cramp, you kind of have to stop. You're not going to be able to produce that same output. So then I would then argue, it's like, well, are we getting the same benefit of the session? Absolutely not, because we're not able to produce the same output as what we should be to get the benefit of that speed session. If we're talking sort of VO2 and you're really sort of starting to feel the burning effect, and you're doing if you're doing 1-to-1 work to restoration of VO2 and you're really starting to feel the burn and it's a struggle, you're probably either going out too hard or you're not giving yourself that full recovery that you need, which again is then a bit of a sign of, are you actually doing the right type of training, or are you manipulating the training variables to give you the best output and effect? Probably not. So hopefully that sort of answers both of those questions there. And give me a thumbs up in the chat, or leave a quick comment if you can, mate, to let me know if I've answered those ones. Pushing through things, there's a time and place for it. If you're time trialing and you're just trying to get to the end and there's nothing structurally wrong, you haven't done any injuries, you haven't pulled anything, rolled anything, and it is just putting up with a bit of hurt for 5 or so minutes, perfectly fine, go for it. That's what racing is kind of all about, isn't it? For some people in some events. If it's an injury, wouldn't bother. If it's cramping, you're probably not going to be able to, and you're probably not going to be able to produce that output. And particularly if we're talking training sessions, we're talking quality over quantity, I'd be pulling it there and just saying, well, okay, today's not my day. What do I need to do to maybe prevent that from happening? Do I need to adjust what my training is like to minimize that effect as well? So good to see you've got there well answered. So thanks for sending that one through. And again, hopefully you got a bit out of my explanation there. I know there's still a few of us in here. That wraps up all the questions that I had that came through via Instagram, came through on YouTube in the comments prior to the stream from people who couldn't make it. And all the comments so far in the chat, we answered all the questions in there as well. So if anyone who's watching now does have a question they wanted to get answered before we finish up, more than happy to take it. Chuck it in the chat. Nice, like super quick. Just punch it in. I'll give you a little bit of time now if you are typing away. If you did want to get anything answered. Otherwise, we might start to wrap it up, because we've been on here almost getting close to 50 minutes now. So a really good live stream tonight. And I really appreciate your staying on and getting involved in the discussion as always. While I am waiting the last little bit to see if anyone's got a question, as always, make sure you subscribe to the channel, share the live stream links, share the videos to people you think might be interested. Let's keep growing and building this great community we got. We're getting some awesome discussion coming across in these streams. I've been really loving having this Q&A with you guys over the last while, weekly, jumping in, having that conversation and getting that conversation started, helping you educate you a little bit on the science behind some of the performances and the training that you're doing out in the field as well. I obviously enjoy doing it as a job, but I get the benefit for me is really being able to see some of you jump in and get something from it, take away some key takeaways and implement it out in the field and start to get the results as a byproduct of talking about these issues, talking about bringing up your questions and working through the process nice and logically and hopefully giving you some practical advice that you can kind of go away and implement straight away. As always, head across to Instagram as well. As I mentioned, a few of the questions that came through that I talked through that weren't in the chat, came through before we started the live stream from people who couldn't join us tonight. Head over to Instagram, easiest way to get directly in contact. Send a direct message on there. You can ask your question. I'll always send a response and get back to you as soon as I can. Bring it up on the live stream later for others to hear as well if you can't make it. So a great one if you're watching on the replay now and you're not able to make Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Melbourne time for the live streams, which is where we're going to be staying for the next little while. Jump over to Instagram, ask me your questions there. Ask it away in the comment section of videos is always another good one. Sometimes I don't get notified of those. That's why Instagram is probably the best method. But if you are jumping across to Instagram and you haven't followed already, help us hit 1,000 followers on the @NJ_sportscience page on Instagram. We're very, very close, not too far off, and it'd be really, really cool to sort of hit 1,000 on there and start to build the community sort of in a number of different ways. Because I know there's some people here on YouTube who watch. There's some people over on Instagram who watch my content there. Let's try and get everyone together and let's keep building what we've got going here. So looks like there's not too many coming through, or nothing really coming through in the chat. So hopefully we've answered all the questions for tonight. And if you do have one that you want to ask later on, like I said, head over to Instagram and send it through. Happy to answer it there, and maybe we can chat about it on a future live stream as well. Thanks for joining, guys. I might wrap it up there. As always, looking forward to seeing you again on a Wednesday night. Keep an eye out for the highlights video of the best questions and some of the good discussion we had tonight. The full replay will be up, and any future videos coming, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on to keep up to date with those. But otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.